for joining us for the second round housing application workshop for our Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. This session is being recorded and we will post it to our IEDA website for our program, so you can come back and watch it. Additionally, the slides will be posted there for your reference. For anyone who may not be familiar with the Teams platform, it's very similar to other web-based meeting platforms where you have your volume and your camera. You can use those to turn on and off. We just request that most members keep themselves muted during the presentation, and you'll have an opportunity to use the raise hand function and unmute yourself to ask questions after the presentation. Additionally, there is a chat box in the upper controls, and you can also type in any questions or comments during the chat box during the session. And then if you have questions or comments after the session, both Makaria and I's email addresses are here. You can send us emails directly, or again, you can use that chat function to send messages during this meeting. So what are we here to talk about today? We're here to discuss the 2019 Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funding, and particularly the funds that we've set aside for new construction of housing after the 2019 flooding disaster event. So this is just a brief timeline of how we got to where we are now with the programs that we have open. And just to remind everyone that these funds are specifically tied to Disaster 4421, the spring Iowa flooding event, which impacted both the Mississippi and the Missouri, but primarily southwest Iowa along the Missouri River. The disaster event spanned from March to June of 2019. The state was actually very lucky to be included in the additional supplemental appropriations for disaster relief act signed by the president on June 6th of 2019, which allowed Congress to designate funds to the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development for the purpose of supplemental disaster recovery efforts. So these are funds, unlike FEMA that has funds that come immediately after a disaster for immediate disaster response. These are more long-term recovery funds from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which allows us to focus on the new production of housing, which is what we're here primarily to speak about today. From that June 6th act of Congress, it took HUD until December of that year to allocate the amount of funds that each state or city would receive. In January of 2020, HUD issued the Federal Register Notice, which is essentially the program rules for this allocation of funding. And from February to July, the state of Iowa, here at our office, the Iowa Economic Development Authority, completed and submitted our financial management and grant compliance certifications, along with our action plan, which programs the funds to best meet the unmet needs of the state. In July of 2020, HUD approved our action plan, and in December of 2020, HUD executed our grant agreement that allows us to offer programs. We offered our first round of housing programs last January, making awards this past April. And now, June, we opened, and July, we're having our application workshop for our second round of competitive housing projects. Just a little bit of a background on how we can use these funds. That act of Congress and the appropriation from HUD allocated to the state $96,741,000. The goal for the state is to quickly turn those funds into valued construction for recovery and rebuilding. We really strive to fit the right funds with the right projects. As you may be familiar, many federal programs or other state funding incentives all have some element of a string or a requirement for their program. HUD has many of those red tape or bureaucratic components, and so we really want to find the best and highest use for these funds to make sure that they are the right fit, so that we're not trying to fit the wrong shape into the wrong box and making funds work where other funds might be an easier or less bureaucratic path for those programs. As I mentioned, HUD issued a Federal Register notice in January of 2020 for the rules of these programs. In addition to that notice, there are 5 other regulatory Federal Register notices that provide the rules and requirements for this program. We don't expect you to understand or read all of those Federal Register notices, but we just want to give you a sense that the programs that we have designed are within the parameters of the compliance requirements that HUD sets forth for us as a state. So oftentimes there may be requirements that seem overly restrictive, and that's generally the sense that those come from HUD regulations. We as a state like to create programs that best fit the needs of the state without being more restrictive than the program requirements. And then we have 6 years from December of 2020 to December of 2026 to expend all $96 million appropriated to the state. In addition, HUD has established what they call our most impacted and distressed areas. These were initially identified by zip code from HUD, but HUD later indicated that zip codes expand out to the entire county. So 80% of that 96 million, so 77,393,000, must be spent in most impacted and distressed unmet recovery needs areas. And for this disaster event, those include Harrison County, Mills County, and Fremont County. Additionally, $64 million, or 70% of our activity funds, have to benefit persons of low to moderate income. For HUD's purposes, low to moderate income means any household at or below 80% of the area median income based on household size and total income for the household. For example, to qualify as an LMI household, the total household income would need to be at or below the following. So here we've identified some of the county or municipal areas within our most impacted and distressed, or our other eligible areas in terms of disaster declarations for individual assistance. So you can see here that Mills County, for example, falls in the Omaha, Council Bluffs, Nebraska, Iowa metropolitan area, and a single person income of $49,200 would qualify as meeting at or below that 80% area median income or count as an LMI. So we like to show these numbers to give folks the reassurance that many of your typical tenants or rental or home buyers, first time, starting out, school teachers, nurses, public service members, many of them would qualify for the low to moderate income level. So we just like to make this information as available as possible so that there's no misconception about who or what is a low to moderate income buyer or tenant. Additionally, in terms of our community benefit or public infrastructure benefit programs, we can assess LMI at a geographic basis. So communities who meet the low to moderate income percentage above 51% for the census data, the ACS data, can also be broadly considered a low to moderate community, and we can invest public infrastructure or stormwater management in those communities. So such as Hamburg, Missouri Valley, or Pacific Junction, just based on the census data, would qualify for these area public benefits. Now, other communities that may not hit the 51% at a census level can still seek to apply for low to moderate income area benefits by designing a service area where that public infrastructure would serve a service area that qualified as LMI. And you would just have to conduct a survey to show that the service area of that public utility or public infrastructure is predominantly low to moderate income. The remaining 30% of our funds can be used for urgent need persons or areas who are over that 80% AMI income level, or for a slum and blight elimination, so demolition and clearance program. Those are the other HUD national objectives that we can meet outside of our requirement for 70% beneficiaries of LMI programs. Much of our urgent need in this disaster event is assisting those buyout recipients that are over income. And we can talk a little bit more about that as we move through our proposed action plan and programs. So as I talked about at the beginning, the state in early 2020 went through a process of determining what were the unmet needs after the spring 19 flooding event, and how would we best program or allocate our funds that we received from HUD, into new programs. We did this by primarily looking at 4 main funding opportunities. We looked at buyout, we looked at demolition clearance, we looked at the construction of new housing, both rental and single family, and we looked at stormwater infrastructure. Additionally, we have funds allocated for planning and for admin, both state and local administration. So again, those programs, looking at buyout, really making sure that buyout is prioritized first and foremost, as we see that buyout is a significant step in fully recovering from a disaster event. So those with flood impacted homes that could not return to those properties, or it wasn't feasible for them to return to those properties, giving them an avenue to assist the communities in buying them out from those properties so that they can reside elsewhere. Demolition clearance allows communities to help property owners by demolishing flood damaged structures without deed restrictions to their properties. Our housing incentive program, which is what we're here to talk about today, is to really make construction of new housing units feasible in these locations where the cost of new construction has outpaced the ability for residents to afford clean, quality, and affordable housing. This incentive is designed to create affordable housing outside of flood risk areas, and we anticipate that we may be able to generate as many as 300 new housing units in our most impacted and distressed counties of Mills, Fremont, and Harrison. Depending on demand, available funds, and timing, we may be able to expand out to other eligible locations. And then providing some infrastructure funding to help municipalities ensure that they are better able to prevent future disasters and utilities are scaled properly for future risk. So how to apply? We use a web grants portal system called iowagrants.gov. All applicants are submitted to the state through this website, and only qualified CDBG-DR program providers, so councils of governments or qualified consultants, can apply on behalf of a unit of local government. So all awards that we make at the state level are made to a unit of local government, a city or a county. Therefore, the local municipality is technically the applicant for CDBG-DR funding. Local councils of government or regional planning entities or IEDA-approved qualified consultants are regularly trained on CDBG rules and regulations and the state's application system. Only these qualified entities can submit an application for CDBG-DR. An application team must coordinate with the COG or consultant in order to successfully develop and submit an application. This is a true team effort. We're going to go into the very specific details about our housing incentive program, which ultimately reimburses builders, contractors, developers, owners for the construction of housing. However, the only way to successfully apply and receive an award is to have the coordination and support of the unit of local government where the new housing will be placed, and the qualified grant administrator to assist in the application and federal compliance for this program. Speaking of federal compliance, all projects are subject to federal rules and regulations. Most of these rules are incorporated in our program guidelines, which we will have links to later on in this presentation, as well as our 2019 CDBG-DR Policies and Procedures Manual, which is available on our website. In order to ensure that federal compliance is taken into consideration in application development, we include required uploads for all applicants to be considered for this funding. These include, but are not limited to, a resolution of support from the applicant municipality, so the city or county must take action at a hearing and provide a resolution of support. We also require some HUD disclosure forms that are submitted and signed by that municipal applicant. federal assurances pages. And then we've added this year a developer assurances form because we did feel like the application for new housing is very much being driven by the owner developer of this housing project, which is separate from our applicant. And so we just really want to connect those dots and make sure that all parties involved understand the federal requirements that are being imposed on these programs as you work on establishing or creating your application. So one thing that's very important for disaster recovery funds, and that's actually mandated by Congress, is that we do not duplicate other benefits. I'm going to ask that everyone mute themselves. I'm getting some. I'm just going to everyone's muted. Okay, I've muted everyone, so hopefully that will work. What I was saying is that Congress, when they passed both this law and the Stafford Act, which manages much of disaster recovery, has a prohibition on the duplication of benefits. So basically they say that we cannot make awards with these HUD funds that are a duplicative benefit of any other program that would be making a similar award. It's mandated that we as a state have a process and a procedure to ensure that that duplication does not occur. Some DOBs may be calculated at award through an analysis of application information, while others may be documented later in the program as beneficiaries are determined. For the new housing program that Makaria will be talking about here in just a few minutes, we use a DOB certification signed by the developer owner and uploaded with the application to document the potential for any duplicative benefits. We understand that with new housing production, it is very rare that another program would provide a similar financial structure that would be considered duplicative. But in order for us to have the proper duplication or documentation in place, we require that DOB certification be completed and uploaded with the application. All right, Makaria is going to go ahead and take over here and talk a little bit about what's new with this round of housing, and then go into the application details and eligible housing programs. Makaria, you'll need to unmute yourself and you should be able to present.
All right, good morning, everyone. So as Anne said, I'm going to take over here for a little while to go over a lot of the housing program overview and criteria. So to start out, what's new with our second round of application? So if you were at the first workshop back in December, this is mainly for you guys to kind of figure out what changes we made for this second round. So first of all, we added new documents and templates to this application, which, as we talked about, include the developer assurances, the duplication of benefit certifications, and then there is a few template legal documents such as the development agreement for the city and developer that we'll talk about a little bit later. Additionally, we have increased the housing incentive for the single family for sale projects. And we have expanded the definition of single-family homes, which now include freestanding single-family homes, in addition to duplex and fourplexes that will be sold as individual units. We have also clarified the definition of public infrastructure for our additional supplemental funding requests. We have clarified and updated the forms for our Green Plus requests. And we have updated forms for increased cost of compliance requests, which we'll talk about all three of those a little bit later. And last but not least, we will be going over the new Section 3 compliance, which just came out, which will be applicable to these projects. Next slide.
I advanced it. Did it go?
There we go. All right. So to talk about some general points, so currently for the housing program, we have a little bit above 16 million available. However, if there is need, we do have the ability to make some amendments to our action plan to bring in some extra money for the housing projects if need be from our other programs within the CDBG-DR 2019 program. So to start out, we have included links directly to the guidelines for both the multifamily and rental housing program and the single family and down payment assistance. As Ann stated, you will be able to access these guidelines and this presentation after we've completed it on our website. So to go into a little bit more detail, for multifamily and rental housing, this program and projects will be awarded as non-receding forgivable loans in the amount of the award for the affordability period, which is either 5 years for 4 units or less, or 20 years for 5 units or more. In addition, there will be a 10% retainage held until LMI qualified tenants occupy 51% of the units. For our single family and down payment assistance program, this will be awarded as a non-receding forgivable loan in the amount of the award to the developer during construction. All sold units must utilize CDBG-DR down payment assistance for this program and as a benefit to the buyer, providing 50% of the minimum required down payment and recorded with a 5-year receding lien for this program. And all buyers must also qualify as LMI. All right, just some general program overview for the housing program. So eligible entities are city and county governments located in those mid-counties that we detailed before. Applications for both of these programs are due at 4 p.m. Thursday, September 30th, 2021. We do have a final link or a final slide that does show that date again if you miss it. So we also have $10 million available for public infrastructure needs in support of these housing units, which can be requested as additional supplemental funding. For future rounds, there will be established and they will have no less than 1 round per year until the funds of this program are fully expended. All new units must be constructed outside the 100-year regulatory floodplain, and priority will be given to the projects located outside of the 500-year floodplain. Future mapping should be taken into consideration when possible to best forecast future homeowner expenses. All units must have access and connection to municipal utilities, including water and sewer, and projects will not be eligible if they are dependent on wells and/or septic systems. There is a mandatory design consultation that will be available to all developers to ensure proper integration of high performance housing home design, and all new housing projects will be required to participate prior to applying for the CDBG-DR construction funding. This consultation will also include a briefing over Green Street's criteria for the projects. You can contact Jeff Geertz I have listed his email there below to schedule a design consultation. And if you don't catch his email, just give me a call or send me an email and I can provide that information to you. All right, the big changes are the incentives within our housing program. So like the last round, our rental housing projects are capped at a $75,000 per unit construction costs. However, for our single family for sale projects, we have increased that per housing unit dollar amount from $75,000 to $100,000. So that's the big change for this slide. All right, some criteria for both programs. So there is a 40 maximum number of units per application. We do have a $3 million max housing award per application, and projects must meet the Green Street's baseline requirements per project. Developers will be allowed to request an increased award for voluntary complying with Green Street's plus criteria, which is on top of that Green Street's baseline requirements. And we'll go into a little bit more detail later in the presentation about that. In addition, the Davis-Bacon Act compliance is required for our housing program. However, applications with 7 units or fewer of residential construction are exempt from this compliance requirement. In addition, all public infrastructure will be subject to federal labor standards and Davis-Bacon prevailing wage compliance. And construction contracts must be separated from housing contracts. This is just to kind of detail out how much the project will cost with regularly, and then what we need to be able to see the estimates for the Davis-Bacon prevailing wages compliance on top of that. Finally, as stated before, single-family housing now includes freestanding single-family homes as well as attached duplexes or fourplexes that will be sold as individual units. All right, here we go into some examples of calculating incentives for projects. So just a quick note, incentives can be drawn down during construction. This can be done through Iowa grants with claims, and they have to be based on actual documentation. But the contract with IEDA will not be closed until housing units are occupied. So looking into some examples for our housing program. So say a developer proposes to build 5 twin homes to sell. So that incentive would be 100,000 times 10 units would be a baseline of $1 million for a project. If you were to build 20 units for a multifamily rental, the incentives would be 75,000 per unit times 20 units would be a $1.5 million project. And last but not least, we actually use this example in the future and a little bit later in the presentation, but we have an incentive for 4 single-family homes for sale. So that incentive would be 100,000 times 4 units would be a $400,000 project. All right, so the sale of housing units must be capped at no more than $175,000 per unit. And we have also included a little graph here that's basically drawn out to detail developer profit for housing units within our program. So let's say we have 1 housing unit and the cost to build that 1 unit is $250,000. The developer incentive that would be paid out by IEDA for construction would be $100,000. And then say you sell that house for that cap of $175,000. So if you take your sale price of $175,000, add that to the developer incentive of $100,000, you can then subtract the total cost to build, which is $250,000, and you would end up with a developer profit of $25,000 for 1 unit. So the minimum profit for profit is $25,000 per unit based on, let's say, a $250,000 cost to build that house. All sales must be LMI qualified buyers, as stated before. All rental units are subject to HUD's 65% home rent limits for the LMI tenants for the term of affordability, which is either that 5 or 20 year. And all units, rental and sales must be offered to flood impacted victims for 4 months prior to being open to the general public. All right, here we have a screen grab directly from our Iowa grants application of the required attachments. So the big changes from the last round are highlighted with the red arrows, and that includes the developer assurances form, which is linked there. The next slide is of that form, so we'll go into a little bit more detail about that. In addition, we do have a new development agreement, which our legal team designed, which is the development agreement between the developer and the city. In addition, that will also be linked in the Iowa grants website, but it is not in this picture, unfortunately. And last but not least, we do have a duplication of benefits certification, which that template is also provided there within Iowa grants. All right, as Ann stated before, the new developer assurances form is basically just to make sure that the developer understands the federal requirements that are being imposed on these programs. So basically all you have to do is go through the check marks and make sure that you understand each of them when creating this project, and then that form will be uploaded into Iowa grants. All right, we're going to go a little bit into the budget section of the application. So here we have the sources of funding, which includes IEDA's contribution to the project, and then kind of details out if there's loans that are going along with the project, and then what the developer or owner is going to contribute as well. In addition, underneath that, we have the uses of funds, so where all this money will basically be separated out and used for. So it could go to administration, land acquisition, construction, on-site improvements, etc. So within the budget section of the application, all housing projects will identify their total project costs and detailed sources and uses of funds for the whole project. And the thing to note here is that both of these sections, the total sources must match the total uses. If they do not match, we will not really consider it a complete project and probably have to send it back for a little bit of revision, but that's just something to note. All right, we're going to focus a little bit on the project rent documentation within the application. So all rental projects will need to calculate their proposed rental income in order to determine if the project will be viable for the term of affordability. This is done by using the current home's 65% rent limits by unit size, and then subtracting any essential utilities to determine the maximum rent that can be charged to LMI tenants. And this, we're going to use this information along with anticipated market unit rents to complete the Proforma, which we will go over in the next slide. All right, here we have the Proforma, which is another Excel document that will need to be uploaded in that required attachment section. So the Proforma will provide information on the physical vitality of a housing rental project. Complete this document to show all anticipated rental income and building expenses along with the debt for the project and the developer to determine the debt service ratio of the project. So this is basically just to determine the feasibility of the project for the developer and to make sure the IEDA understands where if the project is feasible for them to fund. All right, we're going to change gears here a little bit and go over the additional supplemental funding that is available for our program. So there are 3 different categories that additional funding can be requested through. So first we have public infrastructure, and funding for public infrastructure improvements required for housing units such as road and roadway improvements, access to utilities, and other eligible things are eligible for additional funding requests. We do have a slide later that details the form, which kind of provides a more detailed examples of what projects could be eligible for public infrastructure. Associated infrastructure requests will be submitted based on actual cost and need and reviewed by IEDA prior to the award. And this will be asked as a separate line item of the application with support documentation. And we will show that form later in the presentation. All right, second, we have funding for high performance home design to provide energy efficient and resilient homes. And this is our Green Plus criteria, which we will go over in more detail later. This supplement is based on increased cost difference. And last but not least, we have funding for increased cost of compliance. So if federal compliance issues such as environmental mitigation or labor standards compliance significantly increases the cost of the project, additional supplemental funds may be requested to cover that cost. All right, to go into a little bit more detail about our high bar for model disaster recovery. So this focuses on Iowa Green Street's criteria. So for our programs and projects, all houses must meet the baseline checklist for green building standards. In addition, to assist in Green Street compliance, IEDA has contracted with a third-party HERS rater to assist, inspect, and certify all projects funded under this program. As well as all housing projects must achieve the following performance goals to be considered eligible for our program. They must have healthy indoor quality, be safe and secure in relation to safe rooms or basements, have some form of water conservation, and have stormwater mitigation. And here we just have a few examples of some high performance homes that our Green Street's team has been involved in the past. So there's few in Charles City, Woodbine, and Clear Lake. If you'd like some more information, that link will take you directly to the Green Street site on IEDA's website. So though that's just a little bit more information on that, if you like.
All right. Thanks, Makaria. I'm going to go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into the weeds on what Makaria talked about in terms of how we have set up the application for the request of those supplemental funds. So the Green Streets criteria is one that we recognized after the first round that the application process was a little bit unclear or cumbersome. And so while the eligibility of Green Plus items remains the same between our first round program and our second, the way that we have structured how you ask for that has significantly changed. We've also changed a little bit of the terminology. So what was previously considered minimum mandatory is now what we call baseline Green Streets criteria. This again is a component that comes out of some of those HUD Federal Register notices that I mentioned at the beginning. HUD has an expectation that with all new construction, we are meeting a green national standard or a standard that is similar to other national standards. We here at Iowa have always been, well, for many years, been working under our Iowa Green Streets criteria. So we were able to adapt that criteria to meet the HUD requirement. So that would be our minimum baseline requirement. In addition to that, there are a few areas where we have allowed developers to identify where they're going above and beyond the baseline in order to enhance resiliency, improve stormwater, or otherwise create more resilient and sustainable housing. And for those areas, we have specifically allowed developers to say what they're doing above and beyond the baseline and request additional funding for those actions. So those would be in the areas of surface stormwater management, advanced water conservation, moving to zero energy or net zero certification, achieving zero energy, moving to zero carbon, all electric, electric vehicle charging station installation, and the sourcing of regional materials. So in order to do this in the application, we actually created a new component that you see here called Green Streets Criteria. And within that component, each of those items that I just mentioned is broken out, and the developer is offered an option to implement this and request additional funding and provide a description of what it is that you're doing and provide supporting cost documentation. So for all of the increased costs that Makaria mentioned earlier, we are going to need detailed support documentation to justify that award. HUD is very particular about cost reasonableness and making sure that when we provide supplemental or additional funds above the housing request, that it be supported with cost documentation. So for each of the criteria, our application allows you to select which of those you are asking for additional Green Plus supplemental funds for, and then the application will provide that as a total. You do still need to complete the green criteria worksheet, which is here and linked in the application. And those criteria have been called out by sort of color and cell in both the PDF and the Excel document to be able to more clearly show what you would consistently carry over from the worksheet to this component of Iowa grants. So moving on to the supplemental request for increased cost of compliance. With this one, we found that in our initial application last January or December, we had left this kind of vague for developers to indicate where they might have increased cost of compliance. And we found that most of the requests initially were insufficient to be able to make awards just because they did not have the sort of math and the documentation to support those requests. So again, I've highlighted on this form, we've modified the form a bit, but I've also highlighted the necessity of providing support documentation. And this has to be sort of based on true costs or true estimates that you've developed. So it can't just be a blanket percentage increase for labor standards. It has to really show the math. So I've provided 3 separate examples here. I'm not expecting all projects to have multiple examples. You may, but I'm just going to go through each of these so that you can understand how we've designed this spreadsheet to better show the math in terms of what is an increased cost of compliance. So for example, if we know that there are known historic preservation mitigation requirements, perhaps the project will result in an adverse effect that needs an MOA to mitigate, or perhaps there's an extensive archaeological investigation and perhaps some archaeological mitigation that's required. So the cost of the project without federal requirements, historic preservation is one of those triggers that's really only triggered when federal funds are involved in a project. So if you were to do that project with private funds, there would be 0 cost for historic preservation mitigation. But with the project, in this example, the estimate for that mitigation is $50,000. Therefore, you could request $50,000 of increased cost of federal compliance for historic preservation mitigation. The second example, the more common one that we see in these types of projects, is a request for increased cost for labor standards caused for the construction of 10 single-family homes. So as Macaria said, Davis-Bacon and prevailing wages are triggered when an application is going to produce more than 7 housing units. In this project, we have 10 single-family homes. So based on our example, the developer indicates that the cost to construct those from the private sector without having prevailing wages is $1.8 million. They've then assessed the value of the increased cost of paying those labor standards, and they have cost estimates that break down the difference or show the difference. And that total came to $2,250,000. Therefore, the difference between that 2.2 and 1.8 is $450,000, and that becomes the increased cost of compliance being requested with this housing supplement. The last example may be a conversion project where there's a noise sensitive use in the area and noise attenuation is required, or perhaps it's new construction, either way. And perhaps maybe the typical specified window that you were going to use for the construction of 2 single-family homes would have cost $750. However, the noise attenuation windows increase that window cost to $1,000. Therefore, your increased cost of compliance is $250. So again, we're just trying to show what it would cost without the federal investment, what federal laws, regulations, or requirements are increasing the cost to, and therefore the supplemental request is the difference, the federal cost minus the base cost equals the increased cost of compliance. Now, public infrastructure is a little bit different because we're determining here that projects, this is really more geared towards maybe a brand new subdivision or a new cul-de-sac development where there is no public road, water, sewer, utility, things like that. Those are the things that I talked about early on that HUD allows us to fund from a service area basis. We can only do that if the public infrastructure is providing a service to low to moderate income persons. So we've allowed for this request for public infrastructure to come in with housing so that we can make one giant project where we know that we're building low to moderate income housing, and therefore we can support public infrastructure that services that low to moderate income population. So for this, what's very, very crucial is having estimates and support documentation for that public infrastructure, but also understanding that public infrastructure is that which is not on the private parcel of the housing unit. So installation, again, of roads, sewer, water, utilities, even broadband, as long as it is in the public right-of-way, the public roadway, anything that is the connection to that service to the house, the direct house service line would be part of the construction of the housing unit and would be funded under our housing activity. So when we make awards to communities, these will be 2 separate line items, 2 separate construction contracts for housing separate from public infrastructure. And so here you would just provide the request of CDBG housing infrastructure funds in the total amount being requested for that project with support documentation and cost estimates. So again, public infrastructure must be based on true cost and documented with estimates. CDBG can pay up to 100% of public infrastructure, but again, talking about that duplication of benefits, if there are other programs or TIF funding or city funding or other resources, we would want to see all the sources and uses of funds so that we were not duplicating some other source of funds, available funds. But it can provide 100% when the infrastructure service serves at least 51% LMI service area. So again, we're linking this to our housing program because our rental programs will always result in 51% LMI service, and our single family will always result in the occupancy of low to moderate income persons. And public infrastructure must be tied to the production of new housing. Infrastructure alone does not meet a HUD national objective, as there is no beneficiary to a new service area that does not have housing. And again, as Makaria mentioned, we've modified our application just a little bit. So you would enter the number of units you're planning to produce. You have the ability to enter the incentive, 75,000 for rental and 100,000 for single family. You then have yes, no toggles on, will you have increased cost of public infrastructure? What is the cost? Upload our public infrastructure worksheet. And then you would also need to upload the documentation to support that. So again, the same with increased cost of federal compliance, the worksheet, and the support documentation. So increased cost of compliance and infrastructure are here in the application. As I mentioned earlier, the green request is in its own component of the application. And then this is just an example, as Makaria said, she had plugged in an example of a 4 single family home project. So the housing activity amount, that's those caps at 75 or 100 times the number of units produced, is 400,000. In this case, they chose a green plus extra amount earlier in the application of $25,000. Perhaps that's for increased stormwater management on site. This project requested increased cost of compliance for $100,000. Perhaps that's an environmental mitigation for the site that they'd be working on. Housing project delivery is the fee for the grant administrator to assist in the federal regulatory compliance and drawdown process of the project. Because these are single family for sale, there's an automatic budget line item for down payment assistance. We know that this is not the exact amount of funds that will be used, because that down payment assistance will be based on the eligible applicant, the price of the sale of the price, and what their bank requires as down payment. But this is just in order to allocate funds to have available for that process. And then in this case, they requested $1 million of housing infrastructure. So this would be to assist in roads, water, sewer for the construction of those 4 homes, and project delivery tied to that infrastructure. So at the end of the day, this is a $1,645,000 CDBG awarded project. Certainly there are other sources and uses of funds, as Makaria indicated, to construct the balance of the housing units. But you can see here that you can take, if you take advantage of all the plus programs, the intent of CDBG-DR is to be able to incent the production of new housing and to overcome all construction housing hurdles that may be out there. So I wanted to take just a minute to remind everyone about the federal compliance requirements. I mentioned this a bit towards the beginning. And while I have a list here, I'm always hesitant to list because, there's too many to count, but these are kind of the big ones that contractors, developers, those interested in building federal funded projects need to be aware of. The environmental review record we'll go over in just a little bit, but that includes consultation with interested parties and mandatory public comment periods. Federal procurement regulations, including open competition, cost reasonableness, review, and clearing of contractors. So making sure that contractors and subcontractors are registered in the state of Iowa, that have been cleared from being disbarred by the federal government in any way. Those are procedures that we have to go through. Labor standards, we've talked about when that is applicable, and that includes compliance with Davis-Bacon wages, weekly payroll reviews, on-site interviews, et cetera, that go along with that regulatory compliance. Required language provisions in all contracts. We have certain laws and regulations that have to be cited in federally funded projects. There are single audit requirements for the recipient, city or county, depending on the amount of money awarded or expended within any given year. And then Section 3 compliance is something that we'll go over just briefly here. So I'm only going to talk about environmental and Section 3 because those are new and important. Very well, they're all important, but just ones that we should all keep in mind. Certainly your qualified grant administrator is trained regularly by our staff on all of the bureaucratic red tape and laws and regulations. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to whomever you're working with. One of the reasons we like to take a minute to talk about environmental review is because it's one of the few federal regulations that can actually completely derail a project. Most all of our other regulations, there are ways to back into compliance. While it's not pretty, it tends to be possible. Environmental regulation is one of the few that is almost impossible to back into any kind of a approval if steps are taken out of order. This, as I said earlier, requires consultation. It requires very specific publication requirements, public comment period requirements, certain number of days in which documents need to be made available to the public, certain documents that must be filled out correctly and signed by the right person. And all of that is required before the state can do what's called releasing funds. The process can take between 4 to 6 months, depending on the complexity of the environmental conditions of the site. And within that window, so between applying to IEDA for these federal funds and the issuance of release of funds, you cannot make any choice limiting actions until the state has issued release of funds. So choice limiting actions include the purchase of a property, the bidding out of a construction project, entering into construction contracts, or doing any physical earth-moving construction on a site. So it's very important to know that once you've decided to commit to applying for federal funds for a housing project, you do not do any of the following until the state has made an award and issued a release of funds after the environmental review has been concluded. You are welcome to enter into purchase options or purchase agreements, but you will have to recognize that even if those expire during the review period, they can be extended, but they should not be executed upon. The only time I've seen projects completely fail and funds have to be rescinded is when property was acquired during this window, or construction contracts were signed during this window, or construction began. Those are kind of things that we cannot step backwards on. Once those actions are taken, there's very little we can do to invest federal funds in that project. So just be very careful about the environmental requirements and the process there. The other thing I wanted to take just a minute to talk about is Section 3. Section 3 has been a provision of the Housing and Urban Development Act since it was signed into law in the 1960s. HUD has a federal registered notice or code of federal regulations at 24 CFR 75 that talks about compliance with Section 3. But they just this year offered a new rule. So if you've ever heard of Section 3 before, you may have heard about it from a new hire perspective, or a question of, are you planning to hire anyone new for a federally funded project? HUD was getting very little response from that record keeping and felt that it was not working as they intended. So they have changed this to tracking the labor hours of all HUD funded projects and figuring out what percentage of labor hours are being conducted by what they're calling a Section 3 worker. So this is applicable to all projects that IEDA awards after July 1, or projects that have entered into construction contracts, and projects that have entered into construction contracts after July 1. So this will apply to these projects if your application requests $200,000 or more in CDBG funds. The purpose of Section 3 is to encourage the employment of low-income persons, preferably low-income persons residing in a local area to the HUD-funded project. The intent is that low-income persons gain professional skills that lead to long-term employment, extend employment opportunities for nearby low-income residents, and maximize the benefit of federal investment in a community. So reporting to HUD requires the percentage of Section 3 labor hours on a project. And as such, all projects that trigger Section 3 must track all labor hours. So the tracking of labor hours applies even if a project does not have to comply with Davis-Bacon. So remember, we talked about that 7 units or fewer does not have to follow Davis-Bacon. 8 units or more does. And with Davis-Bacon labor standards, we're already tracking prevailing wages. So we're collecting timesheets on a weekly basis and able to see that. So to some extent, projects that trigger Davis-Bacon already have an easier time complying with Section 3. Projects that are not required to do Davis-Bacon must still track their labor hours and indicate if laborers are Section 3 workers or not in order to show the percentage of Section 3 hours worked. Hours should be tracked by the contractor in coordination with the grant administrator as the project is underway and will be reported to IEDA at the conclusion of the project. IEDA will include Section 3 in our monitoring of projects. And we have produced templates that will help track Section 3 hours. There are some requirements for businesses. In order, you must determine if you're able to perform under the terms of the conditions of the proposed contracts. Contracts are not required to hire new workers specifically, but if they do, they are encouraged to communicate or advertise to Section 3 workers to the greatest extent feasible and offer employment training opportunities resulting from a CDBG project. So contractors and subcontractors need to work closely with the grant administrator to advise any opportunity for Section 3 workers. Notifications of employment that result from a CDBG awarded project should be posted to the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment offices. Employment priority should be given to Section 3 workers. Again, the program is really set up to be sort of a greatest extent feasible and what works best. We've found that very few of our CDBG projects triggered new hire of folks, but what this new rule is going to really do is track labor hours. So it's sort of 2 things, right? You have to track the labor hours, and then you have to sort of those labor hours who are what they would call Section 3. So Section 3 is going to be similar to our income verified tenants or buyers. It's anyone under 80% area median income of a single household. So they're treating these folks as individuals. So even if one of your laborers makes his or her income is less than 80% area median income, even if their spouse is a physician who exceeds that, they would still be considered a Section 3 worker based on their individual income. So for each person working on the project, contractor, subcontractor, laborer, etc., the grant administrator will need to collect a Section 3 worker certification. So hopefully general contractors would be able to help facilitate the collection of these forms with their employees. They need to indicate their income level and then their address, because again, we have to figure out sort of where they work in association to the or where they live in association with the project and if they are a Section 3 worker. And then they would provide some additional information about their address and their income, and then they would sign and date. And then this is the template that we've come up with for the grant administrators to be able to enter in based on, the work week, or perhaps if it's non-Davis-Bacon, you don't have to collect this weekly, you just have to have some method of collecting it. So whatever your reporting period can be, you would have your laborer, the range that you're currently reporting on, the number of hours worked, their date of hire, their rate at the time of hire, because I'm not going into too much of details, but it's a 5-year look back. So if someone was hired 4 years ago and were considered low mod at the time they were hired, they would count as a Section 3 worker. And then this form will calculate out our percentages: total labor hours worked, total Section 3 hours worked, total targeted Section 3 hours worked. So we're trying to make this Section 3 process as manageable for the grant administrators as possible. It is new for all of us, so we're providing these tools It's just something that contractors, owners, developers just need to be aware that it is a new federal requirement, and we're working through the details of it. And we'd like to make it as painless as possible, but we all know that collecting data and reporting to HUD is never painless. So just bear with us as we work through this. And then lastly, we just have a slide about application next steps. So really the next step here for builders, developers, contractors, those interested in producing new housing under our program would be to coordinate with the city and county to ensure that you have local support, to coordinate with your council of governments or consultant to prepare your application documents, download all the required forms from the application, make sure everything's filled out. And then housing applications are due, as Makaria said, by 4 p.m. on Thursday, September 30th. We created a really large window here. There's some thought behind this. This gives folks plenty of time to be familiar with the rules, requirements, application. It allows teams to get those design consultation sessions scheduled with Jeff Geertz here in our office and our design consultation team. And it also allows us to review applications and initiate the environmental review process, that 4 to 6 month review process I talked about earlier, over winter months that are typically non-construction months in Iowa. So we're really trying to align the application process here so that all projects that are awarded are ready to have boots on the ground as soon as possible in the spring of 2022. Please feel free to visit the IEDA website. We've got a dedicated site to the new housing production process. We've got all of our guidelines posted up there, as well as our policies and procedures manual that outlines all of the rules and regulations of the program. All right, so now we can open it up for questions or comments. I think the easiest way, I know there's a few folks on the phone, which this might be difficult for, but if you can go ahead and use the raised hand function, we can call on anyone to unmute themselves and ask any specific questions. I'm not seeing any raised hands. If you have specific questions, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
This is Darren.
Yeah, Darren, go ahead.
Couple questions. Want to clarify, is the max 40 units at $100,000 per unit for the single family homes for sale is $4 million. So is it 4 million or 30 houses?
Yeah, that's a good catch. So that 3 million was left over from when we offered only a $75,000 incentive. So 40 units is still the max. So it would be 3 million for rental and 4 million for single.
Okay. And then can you layer workforce housing tax credits with the CDBG?
I'm going to tentatively say yes. I think that there are some challenges there, and I'm not really one to speak to the workforce. So from the CDBG-DR perspective, layered sources are acceptable as long as your sources and uses all line up. Obviously, that workforce is a tax credit that would be paid after project completion. So you'd need to have either syndicated your tax credits or bridge loan with lending documentation to support that. I think the challenge that you will come across is that, our program, particularly with the minimum baseline green requirements, the requirement for safe rooms or basements, the sort of higher resilient housing construction requirements, we're really looking at a high quality, affordable housing unit that's being produced by this program. That's one of the reasons our housing incentive, I believe, is rather high. The workforce housing tax incentive program has a construction unit cap. And I'm not a program expert in that area, but I believe it's 200,000. And I believe that it may be very difficult to construct the housing units that we require under our program within that program cap. And that's where they may end up not being a great fit together. So I think you would really have to look at your cost estimating for those units. As Makaria showed in our example, we are assuming that with land acquisition and soft costs and developer fees and things, that we're looking at about a $250,000 per unit construction, just based on sort of what we've assessed of current material costs, the climate of sort of why more housing development hasn't occurred in these mid-counties. I think that your challenge will be meeting that workforce threshold, but from a CDBG perspective, it would be eligible. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
All right, Larry Wynnum has chatted in the chat. He says, since there has been one round of CDBG applications under this program, can you give an overview of how that process is coming along and when you anticipate those funds will receive final approval when construction is anticipated to begin? Maybe touch on some of the challenges that have been experienced in the first round. Yep, so I think that's a great comment, Larry. So for those who know, the first round applications were due in January, and we were really optimistic that we were going to get things underway rather quickly. What we found, and one of the reasons that many of the changes were made to the application process this time around, is that we found that we just the application window was not open long enough for folks to really generate the level of support documentation we needed for those increased cost requests. So we actually ended up going back and forth quite a bit to get that sufficient information. That's one of the reasons this window is open so much longer. I don't anticipate us having to go back and forth or making sort of corrective requests after the September deadline, because we're hoping that teams have enough time to put together really thorough and complete applications. But that was certainly a delay from our perspective, was just the back and forth of getting the supplemental request information sufficient. And then, really starting that. So finally, those awards actually weren't made until April. So we're about 3 months in from that process, and they are currently going through the environmental review process. So like I said, that environmental review process is generally 4 to 6 months post award. So if those awards were in April, we're looking at a 4 to 6 month window. I know those projects, many of them are in the process of their environmental review record, but I have not seen any of the regulatory publication comment periods, which can add 30 to 60 days at the tail end of the environmental process. So I'm expecting some of those review periods to start here pretty soon, particularly for historic preservation consultation, and then finally the publication of the environmental review record. But it sounds like we're still probably 60 days out on most of those projects being ready to have release of funds and start construction. So you can see why a spring award was much more challenging with this program, because that pushed us to a 4 to 6 month environmental window post award, and they're going to be getting release of funds right about the time that Iowa weather gets questionable for starting construction. So those are really the challenges we've faced, and why we've changed this program to have a longer application period for ideally more robust and supplemented documentation for requests, and to conduct most of our review and environmental over the winter months. So Larry, I hope that that answered your question or gave you some sense of where those current projects are in the process. Thanks, Jeff. Jeff Geertz has added to the comment just a little bit of information about the Workforce Housing Tax and Credit Program, which does cap construction at $200 per unit for new construction and $215,000 for small cities. So that may be applicable here. Are there any other questions or comments? All right, well, hearing none, I really appreciate all of you taking the time. I hope that this has given you some information and some excitement. We really, as I said earlier, have tried to create an incentive program that considers the hurdles to developing clean, quality, affordable housing and has provided really thoughtful incentives to get over those hurdles. So I hope that you are encouraged and motivated. I know it's a lot of red tape and a lot of bureaucracy, but we are here to help. We are here to give you the tools that you need to succeed and to work with our partner communities, counties, grant administrators, councils of governments, regional planning partners, to really see a positive impact of new housing outside of the flood risk area. So please move forward with considering applications to our program. Makaria and I, our contact information is here. We are available to help. And so are our partners in the region who are assisting with applications. This presentation will be posted to that website that we had provided earlier. And you can always reach out to Makaria or myself if you have any questions. Thank you so much for participating and have a nice rest of your day. Goodbye.